crowded financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm the host of Mostly Economics, and I'm happy to have here with me Sylvia Allegretto, an old friend from many years back, who's currently a senior economist with me at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. In past lives, she was affiliated with the Institute for Labor Studies at Berkeley, and also was at the Economic Policy Institute some years back, and actually for many years. So welcome, Sylvia.
Hi, Dean. It's great to see you. It's good to be here.
So, Sylvia, what I wanted to talk about, this is your work. Sylvia is probably the leading expert on the tip minimum wage, which is something very few people know about. And they should know about it because this involves millions of people across the country. And the basic story is that we have a separate minimum wage for tipped workers from the minimum wage that other workers are subject to. We know the minimum wage, at least nationally, is, I think most of us agree, way too low, $7.25 an hour. Hasn't been raised for, 15 years now, 16 years, I guess. Many states, certainly the Democratic states, have raised the minimum wage, so you do substantially better if in New York, California. But in much of the country, it's still $7.25 an hour. But even with that, you have tipped workers who earn less than that. So, Sylvia, why don't you explain to us the tip minimum wage and the tip tax credit? Tip minimum wage credit. You give me the right word.
Yeah, well, I think what you're talking about is that we have this two-tiered wage floor system, I call it. And that is exactly what you're saying. There's two tiers. There's the $7.25, which is the statutory regular minimum wage that's been around for almost 16 years. At the federal level. But then the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers is $2.13 an hour at the federal level and has been since 1991. And so those are the two tiers. And then the difference between the two, the $7.25 minus $2.13, is what we call the tip credit. I don't really like that term. That's what the Bureau of Labor Statistics use. That's what it's called in the Fair Labor Standards Act. It sounds like it's something that's probably good for workers, a tip credit. Like, what does that mean? But it's really a wage subsidy to employers via customer tips. So the difference between $7.25 and $2.13 is $5.12, right? $5.12. The tip worker still has to make $7.25. How do they get the extra $5.12 when the cash wage from their employer is only $2.13? Well, the employer gets to claim $5.12 for every hour, for each and every hour that a tipped worker works at the federal level, as actually part of wages paid by the employer. So tips are not always a gratuity. Tips are often a wage subsidy. So for every worker, every hour that a worker works at the federal policy, the employer claims $5.12 out of the workers' tips that they made as payment towards wages. Money's not actually changing hands. It's just what you call, like you said, a tip credit. And that's how the system works. And it's not really well understood. People are starting to understand it, but like the idea that it's actually, the tip credit is a wage subsidy provided by customers through their tips to the employer.
And this is, to my view, I think it's kind of dishonest. Obviously workers get hurt by it, but also, a lot of people go into a restaurant, they understand the tips. I mean, everyone understands tips part of the wage, so everyone understands that. But I think most people probably expect that the person who's serving them at the table, they're getting at least the minimum wage. So when you're giving them a tip on their meal, $5, $10, whatever, that's something on top of that. And what it turns out, at least in many cases, is that that's what they need to make up a minimum wage. So they're giving them a tip, and that might just be enough for the worker to get the minimum wage in many cases.
Right. And the big thing, Dean, really about that is that there's really no oversight. It's very rare, and there's a lot of problems with this because nobody's ever asking the worker, did you actually make up enough money to get to the minimum, to the regular minimum wage? And I mean, I worked in this business for almost 7 years before I became an economist, like full time as a wait staff or bartender.
I often do
And
more of it working jobs like that to
yeah, and
understand
never
the
did
people
I,
we're writing about all the time. But yeah, go ahead.
and never did I go to my boss and say, hey, I worked a really slow shift and I didn't actually make enough money to get to the regular minimum wage for every hour I worked, and you owe me money. Like, nobody does that. It's not going to happen. And because and then I'm going to be put on like a really bad shift, right? Because the fluctuation for these workers is enormous, because, oh, maybe I was working a nice Friday night shift and making some good money. And they're just like, well, you're complaining too much and saying I owe you money, and you're going to go on a very slow shift. I mean, you can change a worker's income drastically just by switching shifts. So it's a very peculiar situation that, seriously, that we know doesn't actually have to exist, because we're the only country in the world that has this kind of two-tier wage floor system. And we have 7 states in the country that don't allow for sub-minimum wages, like here where I am in California. And we have much higher regular minimum wage, over $16 an hour, and we have restaurants all over the place.
Yeah, one of the oddities, I know you've written about this, that some of the states that actually have relatively high minimum wages, I believe Maryland's one of them, they haven't raised their tip minimum wage, or at least nothing remotely in line with their the regular minimum wage. So what, again, I remember you did a paper on this. Some states have very, very large tip credit.
That's right. So we're talking about this $5.12 an hour, because that's the federal tip credit. And by the way, that's 71% of the wage bill, right? For a tipped worker is the tip credit, the wage subsidy. It used to be 50-50 when they instituted the sub-minimum wage. It was half of the regular minimum wage, and it was frozen at $2.13 an hour back in the 1996 minimum wage bill. And at that time, it had already been $2.13 since 1991. And that's why we have this for so long. But yeah, what I've tried to bring attention to is that the tip credits now are astronomical. We've never seen anything like this before, because, like you point out, we have Maryland, like you said, who has a $15 minimum wage, but they have a $3.63 sub-minimum wage. So in Maryland, the tip credit is over $11 an hour. $11 an hour for each and every hour that a tip worker works. The customer is paying 75% of a tip worker's wage bill. I mean, that seems incredible. It's even larger in Delaware. Delaware has a $15 minimum wage and a sub-minimum wage of $2.23. A $12.77 tip credit. 85% of customers are paying the wage bill. Well, while the employer is paying almost nothing for these workers. So the important part there, Dean, is as the minimum wages in these states have been increasing, which is great, the regular minimum wage has been increasing, it doesn't do much for tip workers. What it does, it increases the tip credit for the wage subsidy. It doesn't increase what the worker's getting at all. It's just taking more of their tips as a wage subsidy as part of the wage bill for the employer.
That is really striking, because again, there's no sort of rational reason. I mean, you're raising the minimum wage, and everyone understands, tends to be the case, that restaurant workers and other tip workers are among the people that would most be affected. So it doesn't make any sense to raise the minimum wage and then have this separate tip minimum wage, that you're in any case not raising it in step with it, but in many cases not raising it at all. That just makes no sense. And obviously there's one reason that happens: the restaurant industry. They're powerful lobbyists, and
the other NRA, as we call the National Restaurant Association. I mean, that's why we have a sub-minimum wage to begin with, right? Because they are the heaviest users. Obviously, full service restaurants and bars are the heaviest users of the tipped workforce. And they're a big lobby. They spend a lot of money to make sure that these tipped wages don't get increased, even federally. Certainly for 34 years now, they've been successful in making sure that 213 has not been changed. But in these states where states where we necessarily don't see very progressive policies, like Virginia, Virginia having a $12.41 minimum wage, but a $2.13 an hour, they kept the federal sub-minimum wage for another massive over 80% tip credit. So I think in that situation, again, tips are really not tips. They are a very, very large, portion of all tips as part of the wage bill, the subsidy going to the employers.
Yeah, when you get to these situations where it is like 80%, I'm willing to bet that in Maryland and some of these other states, you have a lot of workers that are not getting that. I mean, they aren't making up.
Right. The higher the tip credit, the more the enforcement becomes really important. That's right.
I remember when I was in college, I was in the summer, I was working in kind of this upscale restaurant. And if you worked at night, you did pretty well. I mean, I couldn't complain about the pay. But you also had to work, I forget what it was, I think we had to work 2 days a week at lunch. And you didn't get that. And, I'm sure, I don't remember that well exactly what we're talking about. Basically, you're getting paid very little. We were getting the tip minimum wage. We got very little by way of tips. I'm sure we were not making the minimum wage. And, it wasn't a big deal. I was in college. I wasn't trying to support a family on it. And also, again, you had the nights where you did fine. So you can go, okay, it was worth it. But in any case, we weren't getting the minimum wage for that.
Right,
for
exactly.
people who are working and get, more, less upscale places. I'm sure it's very often they're not pulling in, what would it be, $13 an hour in tips. They're
right.
not getting that.
I mean, what you're pointing out is historically, Dean, this is a massive amount of wage theft.
Yeah, and it's again, it's one of these things that employers, it's just this asymmetry, and I almost don't like calling it wage theft. I just call it theft because it's like, oh well, that's in a separate category. I mean, I'm not trying to minimize it at all. Again, just
I know,
but
right?
Have like special enforcement there. So if you go into a store and you walk out with $40, they charge you with shoplifting. You face serious penalties. But if your employer steals, in effect, $40, because that's the contract they signed, they understand, they're employing you in Maryland. You're supposed to get, $15 an hour, so $13 an hour from your tips, and you didn't get that. So they stole $40 from you. And in the event they do get caught, which probably 90% of the time, maybe more, I don't know, yes, you know better than I would, but most of the time they get away with it. What's the penalty? They get a slap on the wrist, and if you're lucky, they'll have to pay what they owe, maybe a small amount on top of it. But it's basically costless to them to try and basically steal from their workers.
That's right. I mean, it's just this idea of tipping has been around for so long that, historically tipping has always been, it has always been about not wanting to pay workers a fair wage and somehow trying to get a hold of those tips and say like, why do I have to pay anybody anything? They can just live off of these tips. And I think this is where we are. But I think what we've been talking about, these enormous tip credits now are very new, relatively new in our history. And very little is understood about what's going on here. And I don't even think a lot of people understand how large these tip credits are.
I only know because I work with you. Otherwise, I mean, I did know that, again, having worked at a restaurant, I knew that there was a tip minimum wage but I had no idea that the gaps were so large in many states. That's something I only know because I work with you.
Yeah, it's gone pretty much unnoticed.
Yeah. And that's really an incredible story. There was some efforts, and some places did this. Some restaurants moved away from relying on tips. I don't know if they told people don't tip, but they tip. We pay our workers. You don't have to tip. I'm not sure how far that's gone. I thought that was a very good thing, by the way. I mean, to my view,
again, that's what the rest of the world does, right? They just everything else we buy, they just price it in. What's the cost of a plate of food, right? It's just like when you go buy a shirt or a pair of sneakers, right? The rest of the world does this, and the tip is gratuity and typically pretty small, so it can be done. And look, there are all types of things that happens when we raise the minimum wage in states like California where we don't have a sub minimum wage. We started raising the minimum wage in the mid 2000s, and we have one of the highest minimum wages without a sub minimum wage. And when we have raised the minimum wage quite aggressively at times, it did upend the restaurant industry to a bit because they have to come up with a new business model, and many did. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing, because some of them did say you'd go and you'd see a little note on the table to say everything is priced in, or if you tip, we're going to give so much to the back of the house versus the front of the house, because that's a big inequity, right? The front of the house is usually quite frankly, white servers in the back of the house is people of color. So that people were worried about equity. So to me, like upending the model, this low road model is actually a good thing. So we could do it. We could do it at the federal level. Again, there's nowhere else in the world that does this. And so you can make the job much more steady, much better, more efficient too, because if you have the low wages where you're paying $2.13, Dean, well, maybe I'm going to have a lot more people on the floor than I actually need because I'm only paying $2.13 an hour. Again, that even makes tips thinner across more servers, right? But maybe you could be more efficient if you had higher wages and the worker could make more in the end. So there are different business models that can be done here, that can be thought about if you wanted to phase out the minimum wage and with like the new minimum wage bill that was just introduced, going to a federal minimum wage of $17 an hour in 2030 and phasing out the sub-minimum wage. Yeah, we got a lot of room to move. But the fact that it's been at $2.13 an hour for 34 years, I mean, I do believe you have to start where you are. But to say like it can't be done or that we can't go kind of aggressively, yes, of course we can. Because think of all of the states that have $2.13 an hour for 34 years. Their labor costs are absolutely going down tremendously, decade after decade after decade. Nobody talks about that. They just talk about what they can't afford to pay more, but we never talk about how much less they're actually paying over time.
Yeah, it's you mentioned how changing business models. Now, that probably means some restaurants will go out of business, and it's always been a source of frustration to me. I harp on media coverage of economics that invariably, when there's talk of raising the minimum wage, they'll send a reporter out and they find some restaurant owner who goes, "Well, I can't afford that. I'd have to raise my price. I'm going to have to go out of business." And I'm thinking, okay, we know a substantial number of restaurants go out of business for any number of reasons every single year.
Very volatile.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's unfortunate. People put their hearts into a restaurant and, their savings, and that's unfortunate. But that's going to happen. There's nothing we can do in the world that isn't going to have some negative effects. I always tell people, if you think you have a policy that doesn't have some negative effects, you don't understand the policy. Yeah. So, I don't want to put anyone out of business, but your workers should be paid decently. And if what it takes to keep you in business is badly underpaid workers, then
not a very good model, right? And a really interesting part of this, Dean, is that, and I've asked a journalist to do this, and I don't know of anybody who has, but we have a lot of chain restaurants, right? We have a lot of chain restaurants that exist in all of these, the federal minimum wage, policy states, mostly in the South. We have the ones like here in California and Washington and Oregon that don't have a sub-minimum wage and have minimum wages in the $15, $16, almost $17 range. And then we have a bunch of stuff in the middle, a bunch of mix in the middle of higher, lower, minimum, and sub-minimum wages, the mix of them. And these chain restaurants exist in all of these different policy states, right? All the different policy scenarios, they exist. So it's clear that they have business models, or at least some folks have business models that are kind of the high road when we talk about labor standards, the high road, the middle road, and the low road that are profitable. Otherwise, why would they exist across the entire country?
I think we both agree that it'd be better to not have workers rely on tips. But one of the things I've been struck by in I don't know, the last 40 years since I've been in a situation to be paying tips, is that you're seeing it spread to other sectors. So now, housekeepers in hotels, they really do depend on tips. I remember one summer I worked for a while as a housekeeper. The whole time I got one tip. I'm quite certain of this because it really struck me. It was a can of, I think it was sturgeon that was left by a Japanese couple that stayed there. It's very nice of them. But that was literally, in the time I worked there, the only, so obviously I was not dependent on tips. But now, I mean, you really should tip your housekeeper, because they depend on tips for a substantial portion of their wage. And I remember some years ago, I hired some movers and they moved me and my wife our stuff. And afterwards, the guy comes up to me and goes, "Well, do you think we did a good job?" I go, yeah, you guys did a good job. He goes, "Well, aren't you going to tip me?" And it just never occurred to me. I sure didn't want to short him, but it didn't occur to me that, movers depend on tips because they did not used to. But
there's a lot of tip fatigue right now. I think, especially post-COVID. And a lot of it was because of what happened with technology, right? The fact that we just swung out the screen and now we can ask anybody for a tip very easily. So, the coffee shop is a good example where, look, they've always had a tip jar out there, right? At the coffee shop. And maybe you threw in change when we were using more cash or whatever. And then everybody started losing their minds when they're in the coffee line. There's a big line behind them, and then they pay by credit card. They swing around the ordering, like where you have to sign. And the first thing it says, "Do you want to leave a tip?" And it usually has three amounts, right? Starting with 15, or even now here the tip starts about 18%, right? And so people are behind you. Everybody's getting all flustered, and do I want to leave a tip? Can I leave a tip? And what do I do? And that's caused a lot of anxiety for a lot of people. And but the interesting thing is those are not tipped workers. What we officially deem tip workers, meaning they are paid the sub minimum wage. So when you leave tips, for the examples you're talking about, those are clear gratuity, because these are not tipped workers. But so the idea that workers are asking or expecting tips beyond being an official tipped sub minimum wage worker has definitely seems to have been spreading, and much of that due to technology.
Yeah. So I wanted to move on to another topic. As we know, President Trump made tip minimum wage part of his campaign platform, as did Vice President Harris when she was running. So can you tell us a bit about what that would do, and whether you think that's a good or bad idea?
Yeah, that's a terrible idea. I mean, because, you write so much about all policies, but typically when we have a policy, we're thinking about a policy, we have a group of workers that we're trying to help, either a group of workers or a type of family or some situation that we're trying to alleviate some economic insecurity. But when you think about tipped workers, and remember, they both of them, I think, Harris and Trump made the announcement while they were in Nevada, I think, right? So now you're in the tip capital probably of the world, where you have some dealers and you have some people that are making tips probably well into the six figures. Yeah. And we're saying they don't need to pay taxes on those tips when the person that's working down the street at somewhere, that they're not getting tips at the retail at Walmart or something. Yeah, everybody else when they're making so the net of who you're catching in this policy doesn't make any sense, right? And so and then you have a lot of tipped workers that aren't making enough that would pay all that much in taxes. I wrote a piece about this saying that let's start with just increasing the minimum wage and the sub-minimum wage, and maybe phasing out the minimum wage, things that would really help every tipped worker, right? Or at least every tipped worker in the 725 states. That's millions of tipped workers. And so that would be the first low-hanging fruit that you could think of doing. And then the other thing you got to be really concerned about is what happens to when you're not paying federal, you're not paying FICA, what we call FICA taxes, right? Which are basically Social Security and Medicare, right? So if you're not paying in, and most of your income, even for the six-figure person, is in tips, what happens when you want to retire? What happened to the money you were supposed to pay into your Social Security? Can you still receive Social Security? So it's either undermining Social Security at the individual level, because then you're not going to get it, or they'll have to pass something else that some other government money is going to go in and pay you your Social Security, even though you didn't pay in, which we know that's going to just undermine then the system, right? Yeah. The whole system. And then they're going to cry again that, we're running out of money. So that was really a big concern also, right? How's that all going to work out?
Yeah, as far as I know, now maybe he has since made this clear, and I guess at the end of the day, the Congress that writes the legislation, but I don't think we ever got a clear answer as to whether he wanted to exempt tips from Social Security from FICA, the Social Security and Medicare tax, which is obviously a big deal. And if you don't pay in or you pay in less, you get lower benefits. And again, one of the things, we all think of tipped workers, and the people working in Las Vegas casinos are the one big exception in the country. Because as you say, some of these people, they work at the roulette tables or whatever, they could get six figures, So for them, it's not paying taxes on, it's a big deal. Is there a reason to exempt them from taxes? I don't see it, but in any case, it is a big deal. But the more typical tip worker across the country is someone working in a restaurant. Maybe they pull in $25,000, $30,000 a year. If they have kids,
Right.
they probably pay no tax.
That's right.
And they might even get the earned income tax credit. In that case, if you get the earned income tax credit, and let's say you're not declaring, and again, we don't know exactly how he envisions this, but say you write down $10,000 from your income because that's tips and that doesn't count, you can get less money, not more.
Yeah, it can really mess with other subsidies that you might be getting. That's right.
Yeah.
And the other thing, Dean, I think you talked about this too at one point, or maybe we talked about it together at a work call. But the idea that somehow I was thinking there's going to be some weird loophole that I'm not really thinking about specifically, but how like rich people are going to be able to get a bunch of money and call it tips. Is some weird thing that's going to happen that we can't really envision right now. That's going to really exempt a lot of the tax burden for people who are very well off.
And that's a reasonable concern. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. And to her credit, Harris, as I understand it, her proposal restricted it to the hotel and restaurant industry. So it'd be a fairly limited area where you would be able to get tips. But again, this might sound absurd, but suppose you have a regular, you're a lawyer or a retainer with a company, and your fee is $200 an hour or whatever. You say, okay, we're just going to make it $100 an hour, and wink, 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 you're going to give me tips. And
yeah, that's what I mean.
Again, that's obviously absurd. But if you don't have any cops on the beat, and we have Elon Musk wants to fire I'm not kidding, he does want to fire half of IRS employees, there won't be cops on the beat. There's not going to be anyone there to catch that and go, wait a second, you're not getting tips of $100 an hour as a lawyer. That's nonsense. So you will see that. I mean, people, it's a safe bet. You have high income people. They have very smart accountants who are paid lots of money. And they're going to think of that because Sylvia and I thought of it in 2 minutes. These people do this as a full-time job, and
yeah.
So,
yes.
So, yeah. So anyhow, it really is pernicious. And also, the Social Security thing, I don't think it can be emphasized enough because, again, if we think of a typical tipped employee, people are working part-year, part-time. Some years they're out of the labor force. Obviously, disproportionately women, no doubt about it. They're out of the labor force often, raising a kid for a year, 2 years, 3 years at a time. So they don't have the way Social Security works. It's average of 35 years during your working career. Now, some people, they'll have 35 years where they have regular pay, and it's based on 35 years. But you have a lot of people, again, disproportionately women. They're in and out of the labor force when they are working. They're working part time. So they're going to be lower average earnings. My reason for emphasizing that is Social Security has a very progressive payback structure. Now, I should know the exact numbers here, but if your average is less than, let's just say it's 14,000, that's not an exact number. If your average earnings over those 35 years is less than 14,000, someone might be yelling, oh, no wonder it's less than. Well, again, if you're out of the workforce for 5 years, if you're working part-time for 5 or 10 years, your average earnings are going to be less than 14,000. There's along that category. You get 90% of your average earnings back in your benefit. So if we knock that down by $2,000 or $3,000 because Donald Trump made those tips tax exempt, and you're not paying Social Security, again, we don't know how, but you're not paying Social Security. Let's say that's the case. You're going to get $2,700 a year less in your Social Security benefits. Now, no one wants to live on just $12,000 a year in their Social Security benefit, but there are people doing that. Yeah. And if you knock that down by $2,700, I'll just say you're not doing them a favor. So, this is potentially a very big deal. And it's unfortunate, we were talking before we started this, that there are a lot of, progressives, liberals who looked at that and go, yeah, let's help out these, waiters, waitresses, they're getting by on very little money. Let's help them out and not pay tax on the tips. And they'll realize that that's actually probably not going to help them at all and very well might hurt them.
That's right. I mean, I think it was it kind of just came out of thin air, and I don't think people were really, sitting down like you and I have to really think about the ins and outs of this craziness. But
come on, Sylvia, you're not being cynical enough. It came out of Nevada being a swing state.
well, I mean, that's right. I mean, it just happened. I mean, I'm almost sure, because I tried to figure out where it came from. It was like, it seemed like they were just in Nevada, and it was like, oh, we're in Nevada. Everybody makes tips here. Let's just do it. I mean, that's what I mean. Like by, just, somebody just came up with this idea, and then it was, the next thing it was in the speech, right? I mean, it could have been 5 minutes before. I mean, I just don't think, again, that's why we didn't know too much about it, because it wasn't very well thought out, but just placating at the time. But, I really did. I was a little bit disgusted with the whole thing. And I was just like, let's talk about $2.13 an hour since 1991. Of course, that's, as you know, that's been I started writing about this a long time ago, when people had no idea at all about this two-tiered wage floor system, or the tip credit, and that the tip credit is actually a wage subsidy to the employer via customer tips. So we've come a long way, but really, when you talk about getting again, I say it all the time, tips are historically about denying workers a fair wage, and we're still there. That's what this is actually about. And like we've discussed about all these other states with these enormous tip credits over $10 an hour, that things have kind of gotten worse, even though minimum wages have gotten better in a lot of these states. But when you look at the whole system, and including tip workers and the subminimum wage and the tip credit, it looks a lot different.
Yeah, no, and it is so important, because again, I think so few people, including, a lot of people are fairly, follow politics fairly closely. They don't even know about the tip minimum wage. Again, I know a lot. I guess I know that because I did work in a restaurant where I was paid the sub minimum wage. But it's something most people, I think, are not aware of, and I think most people would agree it's really bad policy. There's a lot of support. Whenever a minimum wage proposal's been on the ballot, it almost always passes. Even I remember one passed in Arkansas a few years ago. Florida passed overwhelmingly. So you have red states, they'll vote for higher minimum wage, and I'm sure. If you said, "Oh, what about tip workers?" people aren't going to go, "Oh, those people deserve to get less." No one would say that, And so it's just they get away with it because it's one of these backroom things that they'll say, "Oh, okay, we'll raise the minimum wage," and then the restaurant industry lobbyists run in there and go, "Oh, but we need this special sub minimum." And as you said, Sylvia, we could say, okay, we won't do it all at once. There's a $15 gap in Maryland. We're not going to raise it tomorrow. You could do it, I don't know, with the right pace, $3, $4 a year, do it, give restaurants a chance to adjust.
Oh, absolutely.
But the idea that you would perpetuate this, where you just, go, oh yeah, workers need a higher minimum wage, but not those tipped workers. I mean, there's no one who would say that. No one would say that. It just makes zero sense.
Well, it was off everybody's radar for decades. Really, it was off, and then there were very few people writing about it. And of course, I've been writing about it a lot. It's one of my, I would say least favorite topics. But again, I think I do it because, and I know about it because I worked in the industry for so very long. And it was just like, it always seemed a little bit crazy to me. And then I was lucky enough to become an economist. And I thought, I'm going to write about this and research it. And that's what I've done. But like so much of what you do, sometimes we just have to keep going and going and going and updating but in the end, it's the same message, right? That this isn't necessary. We can do better. And we've proven we can do better because we have 7 states, like here I am in California, that don't have sub-minimum wages, and the rest of the world doesn't do this. So we could do better, and we should.
Yep. And we have to keep hitting on it, you and I. There's, you have to think at some point, you'll break through. And again, it's the sort of thing that I'm absolutely certain the vast majority of people, they support higher minimum wages. They would support higher minimum wages for people getting tips now. Right. They just don't understand. Well, Sylvia, thanks a lot for coming on with me. And I enjoyed the discussion, and hope you did.
Yeah, Dean, I absolutely enjoyed the discussion. I'm so happy about the new podcast and looking forward to what other people have to say.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.